but do you want an outline? Okay. Okay, folks, I think we're ready to start. Okay, so today we're going to talk about B.F. Skinner, and to forego your question, this is why he was called B.F. Skinner, because that's his Burrus Frederick. Oh, move this, certainly. So, a couple of things about today. The people we've talked about so far, Skinner and Freud, Jung and Freud, I would say came into psychological theory out of a philosophical understanding of the human person. Skinner is coming from a completely different standpoint, and to some extent that will also be true for next week's lecture on Beck, in that these people are more scientific in terms of what we think about 20th century scientific method. Have a hypothesis, you have a theory, you have a hypothesis based on a theory, you test it, and then you find out if it's true or not, refine, rinse, repeat, continue, okay? Now, a little bit about Skinner. So I mentioned in the outline that he's an atheist, but it's a little bit of an interesting journey. So he was raised in Pennsylvania in a very strict religious family. He had a terrible fear of hell. He talked to a Christian teacher about that, and the end result was he became an atheist. So possibly the method used to help him with hell was not the best. At any rate, after he graduated from college, he from an early age had an interest in gadgets and mechanisms, which we'll see how that applies to his psychological theory. But he also had a love of literature, and after he graduated from college, he tried to write a novel. And despite getting encouragement from no other than Robert Frost, he felt like it was a total failure, and so he went into the sciences. He became influenced early on by John Watson, who was a psychologist in the 1950s, and kind of one of the fathers of behavioral psychology. And then Skinner was off and going with his behavioral approach. So that's a little bit of background there. Next important point there under B. Skinner really didn't have an articulated theory of human personality. So think about Freud and Jung for a minute. And their theory of personality comes out of an understanding of the interiority of a person, their psyche, what's going on inside that you can't really observe. Skinner totally eschewed that, okay? He is famous for calling everything that's going on here is like a black box. We don't know, we don't care. What's important is behavior, what this organism does, okay? So I'll say this now and then it'll become clear as we go on. So what you have to kind of do to think about a personality theory for Skinner is you have to abstract it from the way he talks about human behavior. So I have it there, what I would say is the best definition I could come up with his theory of personality, which is that it's a pattern or collection of operant behaviors. We'll get to what that means in a minute. The fundamental concept behind all of Skinner's thinking is that behavior, everything we do, is controlled by the consequences of that behavior. So just some real simple examples. You're a little kid, you touch a hot stove. You're probably never going to do that again, okay? There's a consequence to the behavior. You learn something from it. You sass your mother and she washes your mouth out with soap. I don't know if they do that anymore. There was an age when they did that. you probably don't sass your mother anymore, okay? But the point is, consequences of behavior, you do something good and you're praised. You continue to do that because the consequences of having done that behavior is the praise. So that's the fundamental thing to understand from the beginning. Now we get into kind of higher level development about this. So we talk about the difference between respondent and operant behaviors. So a way to think about it, an easy way to think about it, is that respondent, well, no, let me just say this first. Respondent behaviors have an automatic relationship to the reinforcer. I'm going to use a capital R when I'm talking about a reinforcer. So, you're hungry, you eat food. You're no longer hungry. It's automatic. Okay, you don't have to learn it, it's automatic. Skinner built on the work of Pavlov. I'm sure everyone has heard of Pavlov's dogs, okay? So what did Pavlov discover? You hold up meat, the dog starts to salivate. That is a respondent behavior. It is automatic. The animal cannot control that. It is an automatic behavior, okay? Now, there is a higher order of respondent behaviors that, in a sense, are learned, but via conditioning. So again, if you remember Pavlov, what did he do? He started with the meat, the dog salivated. Then he would hold up the meat and ring a bell at the same time. The dog is, of course, salivating because the meat is being held up. But over time, he could ring the bell, the dog would start to salivate. So it's become conditioned. It's really a respondent, it's an automatic behavior, but it's learned because it's been paired with something that would, in nature, occur automatically. The saliva and the meat are automatic. Now it has been paired with the bell, so they kind of cease being, they're the same. The bell and the meat become the same thing. All right. Now, let me say this about, so reinforcement is a big part of Skinnerian theory, and it should be obvious in a sense from what I said at the beginning. Behavior is controlled by its consequences. So think of consequences as the reinforcement, okay? Now, reinforcement could be positive or negative. For example, you touch the stove, don't do that anymore. The reinforcement is the pain. Okay, so you'd call that a negative reinforcer. But you do good in school and you get an A and your parents, give you ice cream. That's a positive reinforcer, okay? But again, the idea is the reinforcer then generates more of the behavior. So there's this loop between the behavior and the reinforcer, okay? Now, Skinner would actually come to call this the stimulus. So the stimulus is the hot stove. The stimulus is homework. Ooh, do homework, get ice cream, okay? So the reinforcing of the stimulus allows you to continue to develop that same behavior and reinforce it. Now, the next thing I have there, actually, I'm going to do this in a little different order. So let's look at the bold under letter C, because I should have put that first. The act of reinforcing a response strengthens it and increases the likelihood that the response will be repeated, okay? So the more often you get praise when you're a little kid for doing well in school, the more likely you are to develop and kind of take that habit into yourself and do it over and over again. Negative reinforcers work a little differently in that sometimes one time is enough. Okay, like you touch the hot stove, you're not going to do it again. But other times, think of those of you who have raised kids, think of those of you who have raised animals. It can take more than one time to have a negative consequence before the subject, speaking scientifically, the child, the animal, learns not to do that behavior. But the general idea, really what Skinner was all about was developing positive behaviors. So the general idea is the more it's reinforced, the more likely it is to occur. Let me give you a real-world example, and you've probably done this whether you knew it or not. And I'm going to use an animal, and you may then decide me later. But Skinner began with animals. Maybe everybody has heard of the Skinner boxes, and we're going to talk about more of that in operant conditioning. But we had a cat that was constantly scratching the furniture, so we got a scratching thing. And every time he'd go to the furniture, we'd move him to the box, the scratching box. Every time he scratched the scratching box, he would get a treat. Over and over and over again, okay? The more that behavior was reinforced, the more he scratched there, and the less likely he was to scratch on the furniture. Because the way Skinner would describe it is massive amounts of reinforcement make the acquisition of the behavior more permanent, okay? Now, at the same time, he talked about what he calls, this is right above the bold, the role of extinction. So a learned behavior can be extinguished. Any behavior can be extinguished, except probably, totally natural ones. And the way a behavior is extinguished is you stop reinforcing that behavior, okay? So, again, let's go back to the example of the cat. If we had not massively reinforced the behavior at the beginning and only had done it intermittently at the beginning, the cat would have not learned it, because the withdrawal of that reward would lead to the extinction of the behavior. Why should I do this? I'm not getting a reward regularly, okay? So again, think about that with humans, okay? Think about that, again, this is not something Skinner would have talked about, but think about that in terms of the consistency of parenthood, of parenting. Think about that in terms of the conflicts among parents and how they raise their children, okay? The one who is more loosey-goosey with some of the rules, that's not going to work, okay? Because the child isn't going to learn the behavior. And then if you have one doing it one way and one doing it the other way, it's going to mess it up. Okay, so that's respondent behaviors. Now let's talk about operant behaviors. And in a way, I've strayed into this without meaning to, because at times it can be difficult to completely understand the difference between these. And for practical purposes, it doesn't matter because they follow the same law. The behavior is reinforced, and then it continues. All right, so the main distinction, an operant behavior is something that's not natural in nature. There's no reason that behavior is not automatically reinforced. Pavlov's dogs, you show them the meat, they salivate. They can't control that. That is respondent behavior. Operant behavior is something that happens, in a sense, by accident, or it could be by design. So this is where the Skinner boxes develop. Skinner put pigeons in boxes, and the pigeons are doing their pigeony thing, walking around, touching. He had lots of objects in the box. So they would inevitably eventually peck at a lever. The lever would release a food pellet. Now, there's nothing natural about levers and food, okay? But over time, the pigeon would keep pecking that thing. So it had learned this operant behavior of pecking the lever would lead to a reward, a reinforcer, okay? So that really is the model for human learning, okay? There's nothing automatic about getting good grades and getting praise. That's a societal convention. That's something that we think about, that we have created. It doesn't exist in the natural world. It's not like for a saber-toothed tiger when you were a caveman, okay? So human learning happens that way. It happens because a behavior that somebody thinks is important gets reinforced. And because of the reinforcement, it continues to happen over and over again. Now, I did not know this until I was doing some research for this. So I talked about the pigeons in the Skinner box. He also did it with rats. But drug-sniffing dogs, that's how they're trained. There is nothing about sniffing a box that should lead to getting fed. But you find a drug, you get fed, okay? So, and the thing that I thought was we're familiar with drug-sniffing dogs. What I did not know about, maybe some of you did, is that there are these giant African rats who have been trained to find buried landmines through the same technology. Okay? And they find the landmine, and of course, because they don't weigh in that much, they don't get blown up in the process, otherwise it wouldn't be a very good training method, but they get rewarded. And so they then sniff out these mines because they're going to get rewarded. So that's all based on Skinnerian psychology, every bit of that. And as I've already kind of intimated, you're doing this all the time as a parent, whether you know it or not. Okay? You're reinforcing behaviors that you want to see happen, and you are not reinforcing, or maybe you're punishing, which is a problem, we'll talk about that later, behaviors that you don't want to see happen. Okay? Punishment can also lead to extinction, but it's not as well, actually, as withdrawing the reinforcer. Okay? And I'll explain a little bit more about that as we go on. So that is and of course extinction applies here as well. But let me see, did I have this in here? Okay, I didn't put that in here. So when you are teaching, again, I'm going to go back to the cat, but it all applies. So we massively reinforce the cat. Every time he uses the scratching pad, he gets a treat. After a while, you start reinforcing it only sometime, not all the time. So it's not extinction because you aren't totally withdrawing the reward, but you are rewarding the behavior randomly. Behaviors that are rewarded randomly after they have been developed are the hardest behaviors to stop. Because the cat thinks, well, if I just scratch today, I might get the treat. I didn't get it yesterday, but I might get it today. This is why gambling is so addictive. Slot machines are set up to reinforce you with all your money totally randomly. How many have seen or heard the story or perhaps been themselves in a situation where they're playing what is that thing called, the slot machine, and they play it for a half an hour and they walk away and the next person comes and kaboom, they get all the money. It's random reinforcement. So you're reinforced just enough that you want to keep doing the behavior because the behavior may just this time yield the reinforcer. So similarly, with children, you don't have to give a child an ice cream cone every time he gets a good grade. But if you do it randomly after they've learned that this is positive, it will keep the behavior going. Okay, so good news, for your pocketbook. It saved us money in cat treats. It's so funny. I mean, the cat will, at a certain point, he'll just get up and he'll go sit on the scratching pad. And okay, where's my reward? So, now I meant to say this at the beginning, but I'll say it now as we're moving shortly into clinical applications. Given my background as a priest, given my interest in interiority, and Jung is really my guy. This was the approach to psychology that I had the hardest time with when I was in graduate school, initially. It's like, but I came to see how it was useful in clinical applications, and we'll talk about that in a minute. I want to mention one other thing, though, which is the last point under number 3. So even though Skinner eschews what I called interiority, he did talk about what he called self-control techniques. What I've been talking about so far is somebody else gives you the reinforcer, okay? You do a good thing and you get reinforced. You work hard, you get a raise. Somebody else is giving it to you. Self-reinforcement is when you do something because you derive some satisfaction from it, irrespective of whether or not you get an external reward. It has become an internal reward. And that appeals to us, I think, as Christians or as religious people, that because it kind of rescues interiority. And in my mind, Skinner never quite reconciles this. He talks about it, but he still avoids ever talking about interiority. A couple of other things that work that we might call self-control techniques. Stimulus avoidance. So anybody who's familiar with AA or alcohol drug addiction treatment know that one of the things that you help people do is what we used to call, when I was growing up in the Catholic Church, avoid the near occasions of sin. I don't know if that's at all anything the Episcopals ever talked about. Well, it's actually a great line when you think about it. But think about this for the alcoholic. Don't go to the bar, okay? Avoid the stimulus that is going to trigger you to drink. If you have a group of friends who always drink when they get together, don't hang out with those friends, at least not in your early stages of recovery. So that's avoiding the stimulus that is going to cause you to engage in the behavior that you've decided now you don't want to do. Another one that is kind of interesting and a little more controversial is what's called self-administered satiation. So this has been used, it's not used much anymore now, with smokers. So instead of getting the smoker to stop smoking, just smoke as much as you want. And eventually you're going to get sick of it because it's all been overstimulated, okay? So there have been studies that have shown this has worked, but it's pretty obnoxious, and so it's not really done anymore. Okay, aversive stimulation, another one. Again, going back to the alcohol thing, there's a pill called Antabuse you may be familiar with. If you take Antabuse and you drink, you're going to get sick. You're going to throw up. You're going to get it's not fun. That's an aversive stimulus. So you've replaced the positive reinforcer, which is, alcohol, I feel good, with a negative reinforcer, I'm going to get sick. And so then the person doesn't do it. Again, I have never used this, but a behavioral technique for people with obsessive thoughts, okay? So we think about obsessive compulsive disorder. Obsession has to do with thinking about something. You can't stop thinking about it. You worry all the time. Compulsion deals with the behavior. You're washing your hands all the time. You're checking at the stove. You left the house on the stove. You can't get out of the house because you keep checking to see if you've turned the stove off. So a technique for obsessive thoughts is every time you find yourself having an obsessive thought, you wear a rubber band around your wrist and you pull it. So you get an aversive stimulus, pain. It helps you to stop. And again, it's proven to be true, work, but again, it's not the most pleasant thing, but I'm giving you the whole picture here. Okay, the last thing that I have there on number 4, I've kind of already talked about, which is the reinforcement schedule. So that's either fixed or variable, and that goes back to the the notion of the cat and the slot machine. So when the reinforcement is variable, meaning I don't know if I'm going to get reinforced or not, you're more likely to continue the behavior. If you know that I only have to work hard on Fridays when the boss is in the office, I'm only going to work hard on Fridays. Okay, and I'm going to, I don't know, play games on the computer the other days. Because the reinforcement schedule is fixed, and you learn, okay, I don't have to do this all the time. So, anyway, I'll stop there. Okay, now, clinical applications. So I'm going to do these in reverse order. I was involved in this great project for my dissertation, and we were studying this particular thing in particular. And any of you who have raised children, I have not, know what the terrible twos are like, and you know what temper tantrums are like, okay? So the kid literally, correct me if I'm wrong, gets down on the floor, screaming and shouting, pounding, 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 because they're not getting something they want, or who knows why, they're just doing it, okay? So I'm going to ask if anybody wants to answer this question. What is the typical first response of the parents to that behavior? Anyone?
Make it go away.
So how do you make it go away?
Give them whatever they want.
Exactly, give them whatever they want. And if you do that, they will continue temper tantruming for a long time, okay? So, for treating a kid who has temper tantrums, you don't deal with the kid at all. You treat the parent. And what you do is you say, all right, when Johnny starts doing that, what you have to do is ignore Johnny. Totally ignore Johnny. Don't give him what he wants. Don't punish him, because any attention you give him is going to reinforce the behavior. Especially if a kid doesn't get a lot of positive reinforcement. One of the things that we've learned through Skinnerian principles is that organisms love reinforcement. If they can't get positive reinforcement, they'll settle for negative reinforcement because they're still getting attention. So you have to ignore the kid. This is the hardest thing for parents to do. The absolutely hardest thing, but it works. I've seen it work over and over again. Now, there's a couple of rules. You want to make sure they're in a room where there's no sharp objects and, those kinds of things. But because eventually they will self-satiate. They'll just give up because nothing is going to happen. But the other thing that I caution parents is it's going to get worse before it gets better. Because you've been reinforcing this behavior, say after 5 minutes, so the kid's thinking, well, if I hold out till 7, I'll get the reinforcement. So you really have to be, and this is the worst time, to sometimes reinforce and sometimes ignore. Because if you sometimes reinforce, you have set up a variable ratio, a variable schedule of reinforcement. The kid's going to keep pretending until he grows out of it. All right, so the other example I want to give you, one of the first things that most graduate students in clinical psychology learn is how to treat a phobia. And for some reason, I can't remember why, it may have been because I was older when I went back to school, I didn't get my first clinical training under this one professor who was like the phobia king. Every kid in the graduate program learned how to treat a phobia. So it was not until I had been practicing for like 15 years that I got a true phobia case. And it was a fun and very different kind of case. So let me tell you about it, and then I'll tell you about the treatment and how it applies to the behavior principles. So this was about 20 years ago. A woman in her 60s came to see me a week or so before the 17-year cicadas were predicted to erupt and be all over the place. I had not lived in Virginia for the 17 years ago one, so I had no idea what this was all about. I mean, I'd read a little bit. She had been here. She could not leave her house. She couldn't walk her dog. She couldn't go grocery shopping because she was terrified of these things. And, you've seen them around. They are a little, whatever. So This is the purest phobia you can get, okay? And the most specific. She's not afraid of other insects. Just these guys. Now, you're rare that you get this kind of a phobia. Most of the time, people who come in with an insect phobia, it's more generalized. They have trouble with everything. This woman wanted to be able to walk her dog. Her husband, during the previous incursion of the locusts, had to drive her to the grocery store door and drop her off, so she just had inside. She couldn't walk from her car to the grocery store. Okay, so this is a pure example of respondent conditioning, okay? She had these bad experiences happen when she had previously been exposed to this stimulus, and now she has learned to behavior. The behavior is avoidance. I'm not going anywhere near those things. Okay. So the first step, a phobia is a subset of what we call anxiety disorders. The very thought of these things caused her enough anxiety that she sought treatment, okay? So the first step in the treatment of a phobia is what's called systematic desensitization. That's supposed to be an A. Okay. What you want to do is help the person become desensitized to the stimulus that is causing them anxiety. The stimulus in this case, obviously, being the cicada. So you begin by teaching the person to be able to understand very sharply, very clearly, the physical difference in their body between when they feel anxious and when they feel relaxed. Now you might think, well, we all know that. Well, we don't really, because we're always a little anxious and we're always a little relaxed. So what you do is you have the patient lay down and you have them tense and then relax their muscle groups. You start with the feet, and you work all the way up to the head. So you tense the muscle, and you relax it. And while you do that, you're also having them take deep breaths. So after each muscle, you relax each muscle group, you take a deep breath, you release it. You're also saying to the person at various times during this process, feel the difference between tense and relaxed, so that it becomes ingrained in them that there is this physiological difference that they can experience. Depending on the person, this can take a while, or it can be done, in a few sessions. Typically, when you do the first session or the second session, you'll make a tape of it so that the person can practice it at home. Because again, massive reinforcement leads to behavior change immediately. So the person learns to distinguish this. Then, once the person has learned to relax, you say, okay, now that you're relaxed, I want you to think about cicadas. And as soon as you feel yourself tense up, wherever that tension is, I want you to use the technique to relax that part of your body. So you're gradually exposing them to the stimulus that is anxiety producing. First in imagination, then I had her go and buy a whole bunch of rubber flying insects. Couldn't buy exactly cicadas, but it was close enough. And she would sit there, or lay there on the couch with the thing sitting on top of her. Again, she would learn to relax. Eventually, the plan, obviously, is we're going to go out when the cicadas are around. She came early enough that we had time to do this, and we're going to walk in where my office was located. There was a garden, so there were a lot of them flying around. So now keep in mind, I have never experienced these guys before. So Saturday, and Monday is we're going to go out and we're going to do the thing, walk in the garden. Saturday, I'm thinking, well, you know, these things are kind of creepy looking, and they're all over the place. They're crawling up my car, they're doing everything. So I said, I better touch one of these things just to see what it's like. So I grab one by the wings, and you know they make this horrible screeching sound. That sound was eclipsed by my screeching sound. Okay? And luckily, having learned that you know, I was going to do that, then I had to practice a little bit, and then because I didn't obviously want to screech in front of her. So we did 2 sessions outside, and the first time she was a little nervous, but you know, she was able to do it. The second time, a cicada landed on me. A little bit later, it landed on her, and she was fine. She was able to grocery shop and walk her dog. It was like the best cure ever that I had. And one of the shortest ones. I mean, part of what we did, because you know, you think of a psychotherapeutic hour as normally 45 or 50 minutes, but we did these in short sessions. So I would relax her, you know, for the first time maybe we took the whole session, then I would see her several times a week, maybe for 15 or 20 minutes, and to get her used to this kind of thing. So there are certain kinds of psychiatric, psychological problems, disorders that are very amenable to behavior treatment. Now, a Freudian would say, oh, why is she really worried about cicadas? What traumatic thing happened in her childhood? We don't care. She didn't care, okay? She just wanted to walk her dog. So why would you go through a depth psychology approach to trying to understand if there might be something connected to her childhood? It really isn't part of the process. All right, so now talking about spiritual applications of this. So the obvious, in my mind, spiritual applications of Skinnerian theory are in this area of self-reinforcement. And actually, I read a piece by John Wesley, of all, about this, and about how engaging in spiritual disciplines, praying, reading scripture, make you feel better. And so, because you feel better, you will do it more and more. That's pure self-reinforcement theory. And Lent is a great time for that, right? I mean, we've kind of moved away for the most part, I think. Charles, correct me if you have a different idea, that, you know, giving up things for Lent is fine, but maybe doing something different or more, adding some dimension to your life might be the better discipline. And I've talked in the other lectures about things that could do that. I mean, when we talked about Freud, we talked about taking stock of your defense mechanisms and perhaps working on those. That's a spiritual discipline, that when you start to see how much better you feel if you don't use that defense mechanism, it's going to encourage you to use it less and less. Or we talked about Jung and midlife, or the second half of life, the idea of self-development and the false self and the true self, looking at what elements of our false self are holding back developments of our true self. That becomes self-reinforcing as we let our true self emerge, and the pleasure we get from that, and I don't mean pleasure on a simple, like ice cream pleasure, but the deep pleasure we get from living out of our true selves, that's self-reinforcing. Reading the daily scriptures, if you read and meditate on those, or reading a spiritual book, like the one I mentioned last week with Richard Rohr, during Lent, that kind of practice can make you feel better about yourself, feel better about the way you're living in the world, and it's self-reinforcing. You begin one of those practices during Lent, and you could continue to do it as a result. Okay, so I will stop there and take your questions.
I'll just say, I was not sure where this whole thing is leading to. Yeah, it made sense. I wasn't sure where we were going with this because it's a very interesting discussion of Skinner and his theories, but right at the end, you wrapped it up, and I said, oh, this is the theological piece. It's finally coming in here, because I figured I was going to have to ask that question, but I don't. You did answer it.
Okay. Well, thank you. As I said when Charles first came up with this, I said, it's a great idea, but I have to do the work of finding out how to make them spiritually applicable. So I'm glad I did that. Yes, Elaine.
How much does brain chemistry get involved with the aberrant behavior and some of this?
Okay, so I'll just repeat it anyway because that was a simple one. How much does brain chemistry get involved in the development of aberrant behavior? So that's not, strictly speaking, a Skinnerian concern. And the advances in brain chemistry really post-date the development of Skinner's work. Today, we would say that, I think most psychologists would say, that most, if not all, aberrant behavior, behavioral disorders, mental disorders, have a biological component, a genetic component probably, something in the brain. However, just having that is not enough to develop the disorder all the time. Now, it might be, but typically it takes something from the environment to then happen to trigger the full development of the disorder. So what psychologists call this is a diathesis. I've never looked up diathesis. I've never looked up what that word actually means. But what it means in our purposes is there's some underlying thing, then a stressor happens, and it causes this genetic underlying vulnerability to be made manifest. And the reason we believe this to be the case in many disorders is because twin studies have been done beginning in the 1960s, mostly in Europe, because their system tends to collect data across the country, whereas we have like 50 different places of collecting data. And they've done lots of study on identical twins reared apart, so that the biology is exactly the same. The genetics, the diathesis is exactly the same. One twin develops schizophrenia, the other doesn't. One twin develops bipolar disorder, the other doesn't. So there had to be some environmental factors that triggered that. Okay? One way to think about it is you may be prone to allergies, but it takes the allergen, the blooming, for you to get the symptoms. If you live somewhere else, you might not get those symptoms. Okay? Anything else? Yes.
Thanks, Ron. Was there, did Skinner ever talk about like the multiplier effect of groups in trying to, because it seems like a lot of behaviors that are reinforced with either consequences, positive or negative, are much larger when people are in groups with others.
I'm not aware of Skinner ever talking about the multiplier effect of group consequences or groups believing the same thing. He was very focused on individual stuff, and he did most of his work with animals, and so he kind of was working with the particular subject. For example, with the pigeons or the rats, I never heard him talk about or saw that he talked about rat A pressed the lever and got food, so rat B then decided to press the lever. So I just don't think that was part of his consciousness. But I think it's true. I think your point is true that it does. I mean, think about our whole school system is based on group reinforcement of some kind.
Yeah, I don't mind just turning and facing the cameras as I do this. Mine is a question disguised as a comment, disguised as probably a sermon, but I'll just say first that I participated in twin studies growing up through VCU and the Medical College of Virginia. Thanks, Mom and Dad. And the one question I remember was, I remember a lot of questions, but are you afraid of spiders? They asked that about 1 million times, and all throughout the years, and I still get the literature and everything. It's really, but my comment was that both Freud and Skinner seem to have this certitude about their methods and their conclusions that seem very 20th century. They seem very, I'll play this card, very white male, like we know everything and it's all the subconscious or it's all this. And my sense is that psychology just doesn't operate with that sort of arrogance, like today. And I'll just put a plug in for us as Episcopalians and us as Anglicans, that one of our strengths is humility, and maybe one of our weaknesses too, but like this belief that, there are more than one way to skin a cat.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent point, and I'll get back to the spiders in a minute. But I want to talk about the other, not your spiders, but just in general. I think a lot of academic theorists are very arrogant. Okay, it kind of goes with the territory. But I agree with Charles that I think psychology today has moved beyond that kind of rigidity. Most practicing clinicians would not identify themselves as a Freudian, a Jungian, a Skinnerian. They would say they practice eclectic approaches. They do things that work. They borrow from everything. So one is not better than another. In terms, it's based on results. Another thing that came to mind when you were talking, most of you have heard of Kohlberg and the stages of moral development. Does that sound familiar in general? So Kohlberg was criticized maybe about 20 or 30 years after he published his book, that it was all of his subjects were white males. And there was a woman, I cannot remember her name, was a psychologist who developed a whole different approach to moral development for women. So I do think Charles's point is well taken. Now, back to the spiders. And it made me think of something else. The most common, at least back in when I was in graduate school, the most commonly reported phobia that practitioners would tell you about was a snake phobia. Most of us don't like snakes. But think about this. How often do you see one? So what would be the point of going through psychotherapy about a snake phobia if you're not around snakes? You're living in New York City, the chances of seeing a snake are pretty slim. So I always thought it was interesting that this was because I think we have a genetic thing about snakes. Perhaps it's been amplified by the Genesis story, I don't know. But they're yucky, okay? But most of us never have to deal with them. We might have time for one more question. Okay, well, thank you
Snakes are not inherently yucky.
Well, to me, they are inherently yucky.
That's because you haven't spent enough time.
Well, exactly. If you spend enough, sure. I really don't know. I think it's probably hardwired. That would be my best. And spiders can be poisonous. Their bites can hurt. So All right. Thank you all very much. We'll see you next week. Yeah.